Former President Trump is speaking out about the second attempt on his life in just 9 weeks. During an interview on X, he recalled the moment when bullets started flying.
So I was playing golf with some of my friends. It was on a Sunday morning, and very peaceful, very beautiful weather. Everything was beautiful. It was a nice place to be. And all of a sudden we heard shots being fired in the air, and I guess probably 4 or 5. And it sounded like bullets, but what do I know about that? But Secret Service knew immediately it was bullets. And they grabbed me. He didn't exactly hit the target the way he wanted. There's something going on. I mean, perhaps it's God wanting me to be president to save this country.
Trump is pointing the finger at Democrats over their incendiary rhetoric.
You know, this was the second attempt in your life in under 2 months. What do you make of that?
Well, there's a lot of rhetoric going on.
Right.
A lot of people think that the Democrats, when they talk about threat to democracy and all of this, and it seems that both of these people were radical lefts.
However, the liberal media says Trump, the victim's rhetoric, is actually the problem.
The actual violence we're seeing comes much more disproportionately from MAGA themselves.
The former president certainly could do a lot to make himself safer, to make it less likely that people would become radicalized to this point. After the first assassination attempt, Donald Trump said he was going to adopt a different tone.
If Donald Trump wants Kamala Harris and others to stop saying that he is a threat to democracy, then he should stop threatening democracy.
In terms of rhetoric, do you think Donald Trump, in the Trump campaign, do you think they have a problem with rhetoric as well?
No, and I don't. I think especially in light of the fact that there has now been a second assassination attempt on the life of President Trump, I do not believe so. What we are seeing now is that you do have radical elements of the Democrat Party.
Donald Trump
and Hillary Clinton shockingly argued that the media isn't doing enough to paint Trump as the threat.
I don't understand why it's so difficult for the press to have a consistent narrative about how dangerous Trump is. You know, the late, great journalist Harry Evans one time said that, journalists should, really try to achieve objectivity. And by that, he said, I mean, they should cover the object. Well, the object in this case is Donald Trump, his demagoguery, his danger to our country and the world, and stick with it.
So, Brian, Hillary wants us to talk about how dangerous Trump is when she is the one being dangerous at a time when Politico, this quote stuck out to me, the 2024 presidential election is taking place at a time when the U.S. is facing the most complex, dynamic, dangerous threat environment I've experienced in the 40-plus years I've been working in law enforcement. That's a former senior Homeland Security, intelligence, and counterterrorism official. And she had the audacity to go on primetime television last night and call Trump a danger.
Well, she's deranged since 2016. I mean, there's no question about it. She still thinks that the Russians gave him the election, although she paid for the dossier that launched that 2.5-year lark that you had to be a part of, and that the whole country was distracted from. And 2.5 years, Trump had to verify that he was actually the president of the United States. We, as a country, we now acknowledge he won in 2016. She is still not over it. But the one thing that I am astounded by is I'm looking at Peter Baker, who wrote a good book about George Bush. He could be fair at times. He is actually, him and Lester Holt have named the assassination and then blamed Trump. They cite the assassination and then blame Trump for it. They don't see anything on the other side that leads to this. Democracy is over. Our last election, this is Hitler. He wants to be a dictator. Those are the things that incite this type of anger, and that's the rhetoric. But how do you blame Trump for that? It's incredible to me. And on the next day.
Speaking of some of that language that analogizes Trump to Hitler, I think our viewers need to re-see this. This was pre-assassination attempt. Watch McCaskill, watch Goldman.
it is just unquestionable at this point that that man cannot see public office again. He is not only unfit, he is destructive to our democracy, and he has to be eliminated.
A lot of people have tried to draw similarities between Mussolini and Hitler and the use of the terminology like vermin and the drive that those men had towards autocracy and dictatorship. The difference, though, I think makes Donald Trump even more dangerous, and that is he has no philosophy he believes in.
So it was McCaskill there that compared Trump, or said he's worse than Mussolini and Hitler. That's what I heard. And Kayleigh, the Trump campaign compiled all of the rhetoric that has been very dangerous, very targeting of Trump. We will scroll it as you react.
Yeah, this is even a remarkable shift from the left versus the first assassination attempt when they made at least a half-hearted attempt to sort of couch their rhetoric. Now they're just doubling down on it, and they don't even care who sees it. And I was thinking about why that is. Why are they now refusing to apologize for the environment that they've contributed to? And I think back to my own feelings after the first assassination attempt in Butler, Pennsylvania. I've said here before, I went from being a Trump critic in 2016 to a sort of reluctant Trump voter in 2020. And after the first assassination attempt, I remember any doubt in my mind that I was not going to vote for Trump in November being completely removed. I was actually excited to vote for him. And after I said that, I had so many people reach out to me and say that they felt the exact same way. And that moment was so critical, I believe, because for the first time really in politics since Donald Trump entered the scene, people were rethinking what they knew about the former president. They were rethinking what they had been told about the former president, including that he was a fascist, that he was a threat to democracy. And that changed the way that they perceived him. That is what the left is scared of. The assassination attempts destroy the left's narratives about Donald Trump. And that is why they're refusing to change course now, because that is what they're scared of more than Donald Trump being shot and killed.
Yeah, and I think people forget Donald Trump's a person. I saw Don Jr. saying, how many times do I have to have 5 conversations with my 5 children that their grandfather was almost killed? And here I had to have it 5 more times.
Yeah, I want to go back to something that Kayleigh just said, because she's absolutely right. It's reputational harm that they are worried about. So Daniel Goldman, the New York congressman that you saw, who said that President Trump should be eliminated, he said that in late 2023. Not soon after that, he had to apologize. And he didn't say what we all might think. He didn't replace the word right away and say, oh, I meant this E word, not eliminated. He just said he misspoke, he used the wrong word. I want to know what replaces eliminated in that sentence. Like, I put some effort into it. In fact, we'll wait. It's been almost a year. I'm still waiting to hear it. But it is that reputational accountability that happens almost immediately for anybody who calls for the death of somebody else if we live in a civil society. And I'm guessing that Democrats must feel that. They must be feeling it now. But they've thrown that care about it out the window. And so my question is, what really are the stakes for Democrats? It's not about democracy. We saw what they did at the top of their ticket and put Kamala Harris over Joe Biden after one debate. They didn't even move the needle in the political polls that came out. So I'm waiting to hear and to learn what is it about this moment that makes them particularly bloodthirsty as they speak about this president.
Emily.
Guys, the president of the United States said to put Donald Trump in a bullseye. Period. End of statement.
There you go.
And then we have the former Secretary of State saying, calling to action the media to amplify that. End of story.
Yeah, exactly. There's rhetoric that's normal in political discourse. We will fight. We're going to win. And then there is, you are a threat to the entire American political system, which is what the left has said repeatedly.
Hey everyone, I'm Emily Campagno. Catch me and my co-hosts Harris Faulkner and Kayleigh McEnany on Outnumbered every weekday at 12 p.m. Eastern, or set your DVR. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page for daily highlights.